I thought I'd take the easy way out. I've chosen triple talaq. The hearing in the Supreme Court on triple talaq concluded only a couple of days ago, as you might know. There were two sets of petitions before the Supreme Court. One was the suo motu reference, which is that the Supreme Court had itself decided to take on this issue. And it wasn't just triple talaq that they had decided to take on in their suo motu reference. It was generally gender discrimination in the Muslim community with reference to arbitrary divorce, which would be all forms of talaq. And it was also polygamy. So that was the suo motu reference in the 2016 case of Prakash versus Purvati. And then there was the other petitions by a lady called, one was the lead petition was by Shaira Banu, who was the victim of triple talaq herself. But she also challenged the practices of what is known as nikah halala and polygamy. Are you familiar with nikah halala? Yes? Yes, okay, very quickly. Okay, nikah halala is if a woman has been divorced by her husband and her husband regrets that decision because it has been done impetuously or impulsively. He cannot have her back because the talaq, the divorce is irrevocable, and she is, unless, she can only get back to him if she is married to another man. She consummates the marriage with that other man, and thereafter that other gentleman either dies or divorces her. Only in that situation will she be allowed to get back to her original husband. And the idea, it appears to be, the original rationale appears to be that the husband should not take such a decision at his whim without thinking it through, because otherwise he will have to face the ignominy of seeing his wife. Of course, no one thinks about the wife. For no fault of her, she would have to undergo all of that humiliation, but no one thought of that, at least back then. So these were the petitions. She also, so Shaira Banu challenged triple talaq, that is instantaneous triple talaq, to nikah halala, and the third was polygamy. And when the hearing, of course, the Supreme Court decided to, for some reason, confine the scope of challenge at this stage to only instantaneous triple talaq, as to whether that was a valid form of divorce or whether it should be struck down. And they left the others. They said that we will take that up at a later stage. So having segregated these issues, it was a very narrow scope of the hearing. And after 6 days, I think Vikram, Jeet and I had a chat yesterday, and frankly, one can never be too sure. One can never be sure whether the Supreme Court will actually strike down even this narrow form of talaq, which is so obviously abhorrent and obviously, I would say medieval and barbaric. Even that, one cannot be very sure. And it's really astonishing that in this great democracy, this very vibrant and dynamic democracy, we are still in the 21st century. We are actually debating as to whether, this is an acceptable practice or not. We spout all these platitudes on gender justice, and there are a whole string of Supreme Court judgments. You probably read about them, whether it's acceptable for a woman, her career choices, for example, as a bar dancer. The Supreme Court said absolutely she has a right to be a bar dancer, she has a right to be a bartender, Anuj Garg. She has a right to be a makeup artist, Charu Khurana, all of those, Vishaka, for example, she has a right against sexual harassment, all of that. But when it comes to something so basic, we find as triple talaq, the basic security that a woman will not be cast out overnight without any form of security, without any reason, without recourse to any court of law. Even that, you see, we've had both at a certain level judicial reluctance as well as legislative reluctance on this issue. And I think the reason is because, religion and personal law are such hot potatoes in our country that nobody wants to, Nobody wants to take the bull by the horns, the legislature will pass the buck, the judiciary, who knows. We hope it will not pass the buck. But that's what tends to happen, it's just such a hot potato and such a sensitive issue. And, particularly when it comes to what is perceived as minority rights. Now, minority rights, and I would never look at this matter as an issue of minority rights per se. I would look at it from a gender justice point of view. And yet, the way it has been packaged, particularly by the organizations who are actually trying to defend this practice, is that this is a minority rights issue. Now, when we talk of women, I think what is forgotten is that women are the biggest minority on this planet. And perhaps they deserve the most attention, and I don't say this because I'm a woman, I'm sure you know that, but because, women transcend every community, whether religious community, caste, what have you, any affiliation, upper caste, lower caste, outcast, whatever you call. Women are half of every community, and therefore, if we do not look at that, I think there's something very, very wrong. We are more obsessed with religious minorities or caste minorities or race minorities, but much less concerned with gender. When the subject of gender, it tends to impact the community at large, and I think we do disservice to a community when we tend to overlook the gender issues, because it's I think the truth now universally acknowledged that when you empower a woman, you empower her family. When you empower, it's not just the woman herself. We saw that, for example, in Bangladesh, financing, right? And sorry. Yes, absolutely. So you see, women are regarded as the more the reliable, dependable members of the family. Perhaps won't, I think there might be some disagreement on the, but generally I think women are regarded as the more dependent. So therefore, if you empower women, there is obviously a ripple effect on the community at large. Now, in this particular case, in the triple talaq case, the argument on the other side was that, look, this is a matter of personal law, and therefore it is completely untouchable by the courts. It is on a pedestal by itself, and therefore it's beyond, it's absolutely immune from challenge. And I think the seed for this plea is really the judgment of Narasimha Appam. In 1952 Bombay, this was a division bench judgment of the Justice Chagla and Justice Gajendra Gadkar, where the challenge was to the reform law which sought to reform Hindu personal law and prohibit bigamy amongst Hindus. And in the course of that challenge by a Hindu gentleman, what the court said was, because one of the issues that was brought up was that this is so discriminatory. You ban bigamy for Hindu men, but what about Muslim men? They can go about it with impunity. So therefore, this is discriminatory on the ground of religion. That was the argument, which was repelled by the court, and they said that no, this is part of personal law, and unless there is a legislation, it is immune from challenge, because personal law, according to Justice Chagla and Justice Gajendra Gadkar, is not law within the meaning of Article 13, and therefore it is immune from challenge on the touchstone of fundamental rights. And this, it's really a judgment which needs to be looked at all over again. I think it's really, frankly, it sounds absurd that everything else is law except for personal law, and that personal law is immune from any form of challenge. We put it at such a high pedestal. Therefore, if there is no legislation, and it's unqualified personal law, you cannot touch it. If it is, so therefore, the legislature hasn't touched it, the judiciary also will not touch it. So this is a strange thing. The difficulty is this, that on the one hand, the courts have tried to segregate certain practices associated with a particular community as being secular practices, although they are peculiar to that particular community. So if you have, say, marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, all of that is regarded as secular practices but followed by a particular community, and that has sought to be segregated from religion. So on the one hand, what they say is that religion is the core of the religion, and therefore that is what is covered under the right to freedom of religion under Article 25(1), and everything else is outside. So marriage, divorce, etc. inheritance is outside. So if it is outside, why should it not be tested on the angle of fundamental rights? On the other hand, if it is religion, then on the very language of Article 25(1), it is subject to the other provisions under Part 3, which is the other fundamental rights. So Article 25(1), our right to freedom of religion, is subject to public order, it is subject to morality, which in today's times would mean constitutional morality, and it is health, of course, and then the other provisions, which is the other fundamental rights, obviously. So it's interesting because the freedom of religion is the only fundamental right which in that sense has been made subservient to other fundamental rights. And there's a reason, there's a perfect logic for this, because you can't have any abhorrent religious practice which is contrary to fundamental rights. Now, another difficulty is that the courts have sought to draw a distinction between essential practices of religion and inessential practices of religion. And it's possible that in the triple talaq case, they will look at it from this lens, whether triple talaq is an essential practice of Islam or an inessential practice of Islam. And I have a problem with that, that logic, because ultimately we are not, the courts in India are not ecclesiastical courts. We have secular courts, we have secular judges. They have no ecclesiastical training. So how do you have judges who have a secular training being able to delve deep into a religion, read the scriptures, and be able to ascertain whether something is an essential practice of religion or not? I mean, I find that deeply problematic, although courts have done it. Whether a Muslim is entitled to sport a beard, or, I mean, there are a whole host of practices, whether the Anand Magis have the right to do Tanda, Nritya, or whatever. There are whole, lots of practices which have been, in that sense, tested on this test of inessential or essential practice. But as I said, it's a very difficult thing to do, to expect secular judges, and, as one of the arguments was in this case, that look, and how can you tell me what my religion is? My religion is what I believe it is. Which really means that ultimately, the only test which the courts ought to be applying is the test of fundamental rights. There is no escape from fundamental rights, whether these are secular practices outside of religion but associated with the community, you must test it on the angle of fundamental rights. If this is within religion, even the core of the religion, it is still subject to other fundamental rights. So in other words, there is no escape from fundamental rights. Am I exceeding here? Alright, so basically I think the idea was that there must be the constitutional paramountcy, constitutional sovereignty, and constitutional legitimacy is the test which we must apply to all religious practices. And there's a reason, because this explains to us the rationale of secularism in our country. And when we talk of secularism, that word didn't exist till the 1970s in our constitution. It was inserted, as we all know, into the preamble. But that didn't mean that we were not a secular country before that. We treated all religions alike, and the essence of secularism, even at that time, was to be culled out from various other articles of the Constitution, which primarily I would say Article 14, equality before the law, equal protection before the law, and Article 15, non-discrimination on grounds of religion, and that also includes on grounds of sex. And the third, I would say, was Article 21, the right, to life and liberty and dignity. So all of these put together, made us, and we have the freedom of religion anyways. But the idea of this right to freedom of religion being subservient to other fundamental rights, and there was a logic to this, that ultimately, we were very different communities. We were coming together to form one. We wanted it to be a cohesive nation. And therefore, there had to be some common denominator. Therefore, we couldn't afford to, we had plurality, we had diversity, but we couldn't afford to be in these, little islands or pockets of, where we just would not come together. And therefore, we had Article 25 being made subject to the provisions of Part 3. Now, and therefore, if secularism is really one, that the state is neutral in matters of religion, and two, is that it will not discriminate. And therefore, that the assurance of inter-community equality was coupled with an assurance from the community that there would be intra-community equality. And therefore, it cannot be that yes, A community and B community are equal, but A community has the right to treat its women differently. Because then you will have a very anomalous kind of situation where women of every other community have access to all fundamental rights, but women of the other community will not have. So what happens is eventually, this translates into, I would say, perhaps pockets of backwardness. Because if you find, women of one community, it's been, 70 years since independence, and, we've had access to fundamental rights. Women in all communities perhaps were treated very shabbily before. But now in the last, say, 60 or 70 years, I think women have been able to sort of, come forward, access to use their, the advantages of a modern constitution and get ahead. But if you have one community who always lives under this shadow, because it's not as if triple talaq is being practiced on every woman, or every woman is or belonging to a particular community is in a polygamous marriage. It is not that way. But the fact that you have to live under that prospect, it will dictate, it will govern the manner in your choices. You cannot, beyond the point, you have to go the line. You have to go the line because you know the consequences. And therefore, I would say that eventually, I hope that the court will go on the basis of constitutional paramountcy, constitutional sovereignty, and not delve too deep into the intricacies of religion and religious practices. And as far as personal law is concerned, I think it's time to take the bull by the horns. It's time to, as Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote a piece in the Indian Express the other day, that personal law, there are no dark spaces in where the constitutional light will not shine. So it is necessary to illuminate every facet of the constitution with that constitutional light. And I'll conclude with this, that there was a very appealing plea that Mr. Sibal, appearing on behalf of the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, made at the end of his submission. And he said that, there is a golden eagle flying in the sky. And that golden eagle was meant to be the majority community. He said it's flying high in the sky, and there are little nests there. The nests were supposed to signify the minority community. And he said that, the nests, the nestlings want to be in their nest, safe in the comfort of their nest, so do not disturb them. And I think I would tweak that analogy a little bit, because I think it's been seen through a very wrong prism. The eagle flying in the sky is not the majority community. It is perhaps meant from the community itself. It is perhaps religious leadership from the community who does, because in those nests there are also, females, and who want to take flight and who are not being able to take that flight because of that golden eagle flying in the sky. So therefore, I think it's time that every citizen of this country, irrespective of her religious affiliations, is entitled to take full advantage of what the Constitution gives her and move on with the march of time. So thank you very much.